Hello, everyone. Welcome, good morning, good afternoon, evening, middle of the night, from wherever you guys all are. As usual, hello from wherever you are. But more importantly, we're here for an hour today, maximum. We'll try and keep it to within that. And we'll go through as many of your pictures as we can. So on today, well, we've got Spain, Boston, Australia. Alan, you're on every week at the moment from Australia. That's late. Good darts. So New Jersey, Amsterdam, where else? Netherlands, UK. Yeah, there's people from England here. For those of you that are in England, just like me, welcome to the heat. I think in my office right now it's like 31 degrees C, which is stupid degrees F. So yeah, man, we need to get air conditioning in the UK. Normally I'm not here. This is the weird thing. Normally I'm not here in the summer. Normally I'm shooting somewhere else in the southern hemisphere where it's cold, in the British summer. And in the UK, oh man, we're just not ready for air conditioning. We're not with air conditioning. So let's get on with the show. So, number one, we are using version 13.1.1 still of Capture One. That's actually marketed as version 20.1.1. So, version 20, Capture One. There was 20.1, which came out in May. That had a pretty significant update. It had a lot of stuff about before and after tools, and the healing brush got a major revamp. And then there was a point 0.1 release, which fixed a few bugs that came out with the 20.1 release in the first place. Um, so the effectively, depending on which bit of the program you look at, it's either going to say 13.1.1 or 20.1.1. Either way, it's the latest version of Capture One. If you don't have the latest version of Capture One or don't have Capture One at all, then go to capture1.com. You can download a free trial. For 30 days, it's fully functional. There's nothing restricted in it. You can do whatever you like. If you have an older version of Capture One, there's an upgrade path, whether you're on subscription or on a perpetual license. But either way, you can get to version 20.1, and I would recommend it. It's a good version. This one, it was a major release. Some of the previous ones have had minor tweaks. This one, in my view, was quite a big one. So getting all your temperatures in. So yeah, Pablo, heat in the UK and rain in Spain. Yep, it is odd. Hugh's, yeah, it's hot where you are as well, Hugh. Argentina, it's probably pretty cool. No, it's not. It's going to be cool in Argentina. Well, it depends on where you are. But yeah, Jerry in Arizona is 22 degrees. I wish it was 22 degrees here right now. So if you start to see things coming out of me, that's called sweat. Sorry about that. But we will get as much as we can done despite the heat. So let's get into Capture One. So as normal, this is the Capture One interface. We've got I use catalogs. You can use sessions as well, but we'll do a separate thing, I think, maybe at some point on catalogs versus sessions. I know a lot of you have some questions on that. In general terms, if you are treating a shoot as the entire collection of images, so let's say you're doing an e-commerce shoot in an afternoon, or a particular portrait session or something in a studio, then sessions is a great way of organizing them. Effectively, that session is that shoot or that set of pictures. For me, where I do, let's say a shoot is over 10 days, 11 or 10 or 12 days or so on, quite often I've got lots and lots of different shots over different days in slightly different locations, but I consider it one shoot. So for me, a catalog works a bit better because it gives me a lot more organizational tools and a lot of cool little filters and stuff that I can do to organize multiple shoots within one collection of images. And then ultimately, even the guys that use sessions, actually quite a lot of people do this, and I would recommend this, having a catalog for your final outputs. Now, if you're a wedding photographer or something like that, that catalog would be huge. But if you're a landscape photographer, typically out of say 200 shots, you might have 4 or 5 that are the finals. So there's nothing stopping you having a catalog for each of your shoots, and then one finals catalog where you put everything in that you're actually completely happy with. They're the final TIFF exports or whatever exports you want, and putting them in there almost as a master catalog for all of your final images. But either way, whether you're using catalogs or sessions, when we get into the image editing, there's no difference at all in what you can actually do to the image. It's just the way they're organized is going to change slightly. So we'll start off with Bjorn's shot. This one's really cool shots, nice long exposure. So where we always start with Capture One is in the lens correction tab. We make sure that Capture One has got the information it needs to make this picture look its best. In this case, it's loaded in the profile for the lens that was used. That's correct. We can always verify if we're concerned that it hasn't got the right lens. You can always go to your I tab, the information tab, and look in the metadata. And in there, it's going to give you your lens if the lens was stored in the raw file. In this case, it is, and in this case, it's picked up that lens correctly from its database. And we'll go into different ways of doing lens profiles later on as well. In this case, it was shot at f/22, which is a really, really small aperture, which means we might find there's some diffraction issues. If there are, let's just go into 200%. I'm just going to turn on diffraction correction. Yep, and it's sharpened it up quite a bit. What we're looking at is the edges, effectively the edges of things like this. Now, I'm being unfair right now. We're at 300% zoom. But if I turn that diffraction correction off, you see the image goes a little bit softer. That's where effectively the lens at f/22 is bending light in weird ways, and we call it diffraction. That diffraction causes a slight softness in the image. So the higher up your f number or the smaller the aperture, the more diffraction you're going to get. Anything less than f8 or anything wider than f8, you're probably going to be fine. But once you get f8 and above, you might want to try, if you see any softness in the image, turning that diffraction correction function on and seeing if it sharpens it up. Of course, we can sharpen it differently. We can actually use the sharpening tool, but diffraction correction actually corrects for the sharpness profile of that lens at different apertures. That's what the guys at Capture One have done in a lab, and they've worked out where or how that lens behaves at different apertures. That's what that function's there for, and that's what it does to correct things. Okay, so of course we could do sharpness fall off. Now, sharpness fall off is a different thing to sharpening. Yes, it sharpens, but it sharpens the outside of the lens, and this is particularly important for lenses that get softer as they get out to the outsides, especially in ultra-wide lenses. So if I do that, you might see this gets a lot sharper here, but it's not going to have any effect in the middle. So instead, what we would probably do in this shot is do a little bit of sharpening across the whole image, and we'll have a look at that in a second. I don't think there's much in the way of purple fringing, so we're pretty good. If I were to turn that on, we might actually find, yeah, so here's my suspicion. The way that purple fringing works is it looks for those magenta edges. You quite often find on a picture with very high contrast points. When it does that, it then gets rid of that magenta edge, and it basically desaturates anything that looks out of place and bright magenta. If I use purple fringing when it's not needed, what you can find is a non-magenta edge, so an edge which didn't have a problem, actually ends up going slightly yellow or green. So let's just turn it on. Look at this edge here on this crane, this right-hand side here. And let me turn purple fringing on. You see how this has gone a little bit green? I hope you can see that on the monitor. But it's why we don't just automatically do, yes, diffraction correction, yes, sharpness fall off, yes, light fall off, yes, defringing. Some of these tools should only be used when there is a problem. So just be careful that you don't just automatically go yes, 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 yes on all of these tools. They can actually have a negative effect on the image if you get it wrong. So in this case, I'm not going to turn purple fringing on. We don't need it, and actually it would have a detrimental effect to the picture. Bjorn just said, yeah, I tried to expose as long as possible, including filters and apertures. Yeah, so I had a suspicion. So f/22 is sort of a giveaway that you probably needed a slightly stronger filter. If you'd had another few stops on your filter, you could have got it back into sort of f11, maybe f16. But if all else fails, if you hit the limits, if you don't have any more filter, an ND filter in front of you, and you don't have anything else to control the light, then use your aperture. And if you're sort of hitting a place where you want a lovely long exposure, 4 minutes in this case, 2 minutes would look different. It wouldn't look as smooth. So if you were fixed on 4 minutes and they were all the filters you had in your bag, then f/22 is the right decision. It's better to get the shot than not get the shot, and we can have a look at trying to clean it up after. Okay. So in this case, there's a couple of things that we're probably going to change around the layout of the image, especially with this thing here in the foreground. But in general terms, it's looking pretty good. Now, just like the last session, remember that we've got distortion set at 100, and that's the default for this lens at that focal length at 10 millimeters. If I go to my crop tool, we can see that Capture One's actually deleted stuff out of the side as a result of that distortion correction. If I put the distortion back to 0, we're going to get more of the image. We actually get some of this extra stuff down here, but here's the problem. That stuff is the stuff that from Capture One's perspective, it's saying, do you know what? We don't need that. It's going to be too distorted, too diffracted, too soft. And we've got the result of it is a fisheye effect in the main frame. So by turning that distortion back up to 100, it's actually lost some of the information on the sides of the frame. If I go to my crop tool, I can see it's cut quite a bit out. But it means that the content in here is always the best bit that Capture One has profiled out of that lens. If you think about what that actually means, when you're shooting with an ultra-wide lens, and it's a bit frustrating because if you've got an ultra-wide lens, you've bought it because you wanted it to be ultra-wide. But my tip with this, always shoot a little bit wider than you really need, because the second you put on any distortion correction to straighten those lines, get rid of the fisheye effect, get rid of the barrel effect, and to get rid of the bits that are a bit mushy at the very edges of the lens, you're going to lose some of the stuff at the edges. And what I see quite often, people quite frustrated, is they've lost some of the stuff they placed on the very edge of the frame. So always give yourself a little bit of margin just in case that distortion correction is needed and you're going to lose some in the crop. Okay, so from here, let's go on to our exposure tab. So this is the tab that we use probably most of the time for most of you in Capture One. That's the one with the histogram up here on the logo. Of course, remember, and we haven't covered this for a while, but remember you can always add whatever tools you want to whatever tabs you want. So if you want all of your tools in the exposure tab, you can just add them in. If I wanted color balance in my exposure tab, I can have it. And I can move it around within that tab. I can put it into the pinned area, which it is at the moment. So the scrollable area is down here. I can move it to the scrollable area down the bottom. And then I can move it around. Or if I want to, I can remove the tool. So Capture One has a set of defaults. The tools that make sense to sit in the color tab, the tools that make sense to sit in the exposure tab. But for example, if you're a architectural photographer or a city photographer, and you're using Keystone quite a lot when you're in the exposure tab, there's nothing wrong with you moving the Keystone tool here, this tab, across to the exposure tab to make it useful. The whole point of this is set up your entire workspace around the way that you work. Some of these tools are brilliant for wedding photographers but useless to landscape people. Some of them are useless to wedding photographers and they're brilliant for a concert photographer or something like that. But the whole idea of the workspace in Capture One is that you can set it up to the way that wraps around the way that you work, not just the way the developers came up with. The default workspace is great. It guides you through if you think about them as a sort of logical grouping of tools. But once you get used to Capture One and using it the way that you use it for your type of shooting, you might find that, especially if you tend to find you're constantly clicking between two tabs, consider maybe that you want to put your most often tools on one tab, or most often used tools on one tab, and the lesser ones on the other, just to save yourself a little bit of time and a lot of clicks. So, default though, exposure tab. Obviously the first thing up here, we've got white balance. It's pretty much on, I think, on the white balance. It's a little bit pink, there's a little bit maybe color cast on the filter, potentially. So we'll have a little play with it. What we can do effectively is warm it up. So remember, in white balance, Kelvin is the warmth of light, from cool to warm, so from blue to yellow in broad terms. Tint is to correct for color cast. You can use tint for creative effect, but just be careful. It's designed to counter any green or magenta tint in a filter. So use it for that tool, but don't overdo it. If you overdo it, you can end up with a really, really weird scenario. If it's intentional, then great. If it's not intentional, then first off, stick with Kelvin to start with. That changes your white balance as a feel to the image, the color temperature. Then use tint to a smaller extent just to do the fine tuning. Now what you may find, if I just reset this to how it was shot, if I cool down the Kelvin, for example, you sometimes find that some of this stuff either goes a little bit pink or a little bit green and so on, and you've got to counter it. So we just counter with that tint function. So as I cool things down, we might find that these things go a bit green. We might want to then use the tint tool just to pull up back to neutral. Likewise, if I warm this all up, then we might find that this goes a little bit too red and too pink. So we can use the tint tool to neutralize some of those colors. Look at the sun, that's the wrong color, so we're going to use that tint tool back. But it's the tint tool we're using for finer adjustments against the right white balance in terms of color temperature, which is the Kelvin scale. Now in this shot, let's just reset back to our shot level. You've also obviously got the other tool, which is your picker, so the little dropper, and I can click on any item within the picture and tell Capture One, that this is going to be the grayscale, effectively, so the neutral color, and based on that neutral color, what to do with all the other colors on the scene. I'm just going to nip across to Martin's comment because, yeah, it's a good solution. So I have two monitors and set of fancy tools on the second monitor, color balance and so on. If you've got a two monitor setup, and if you've got, for instance, one for proofing and one for the actual work that you're doing, then yeah, you can set this stuff up in a way that suits your setup in your office or desk or whatever, that just makes things easier. The general rule is if you keep finding yourself clicking in the same places again and again and again and going from tool A to tool B, tool A to tool, or sorry, tab A to tab B and tab A to tab B, consider the tabs. Just consider how you organize them to try and save yourself a little bit of time and a little bit of risk as well. Okay, so in terms of this shot then, on that white balance picker, so I've picked on this area here and it's not right. And I've picked on this area here and that's not right, and this area and that's not right. Now this area in here, for example, these should be white, I'm guessing. They're probably grey or white. Remember, you don't have to choose white or grey necessarily. It's just got to be a colour that is neutral, so a colour that's desaturated, so that Capture One can work out what to do. So let's pick on this area of the building here and see what it's done to the picture. It's wrong. It feels wrong. I'm pretty sure, if we check with Bjorn, that it wasn't that colour. So why? Well, the reason is that the white balance picker is being told by us that this color out here, this part of the building, should be a neutral gray, somewhere between white and black with no saturation added. That's what we've told it with that picking tool. The picker tool is to be used to find something that's neutral. Well, at sunset, that isn't neutral gray. At sunset, it's reflecting the color of the light of the low sun. If I'd picked that in pure daytime, so in the middle of the day, and it was 5,500 Kelvin or 5,000 Kelvin as daylight, and I'd picked it, then it would probably get it correct. But at sunrise, at sunset, when we've got any artificial light around, just bear in mind that the greys in your picture may not strictly be grey in that particular scenario. So if I go back to how it was shot, that to me feels a bit overdone, over warm, over pink, but it's certainly closer to a sunset color than what it is if we use the auto tool. So be careful with the picker. If you're shooting at sunrise and sunset, you're better off using the sliders to have more control over things than you are using the picker, because the picker isn't going to be able to work out what was neutral, because it's not neutral anymore. You've got the sunlight bouncing off of it. Okay, so let's go and warm up our tint just a touch. Let's pull that Kelvin back up a little bit there. To me, that looks okay. I wasn't there at the time. Bjorn's saying it's quite warm colors at sunset time for this shot. So if anything, if we want to, we can warm it up a bit more. We can get to there. I'd pull down the tint just a little touch, just to make sure that it's not overdone. If I do a before and after, so the left is our before, the right is our after. We've warmed it a little bit. But again, this is down to interpretation. It's down to how you perceive it based on how you shot it. Okay, so let's look at some other extra bits. Let's look at, for example, let's put some guides up and let's look at our lines. So along here, we've got our horizon line. That looks pretty good. If I were to use the straighten tool, it's not going to do much. But we have got a little bit of a line in here with this tower that's leaning to the left. Now, we don't have anything on the left here that's necessarily completely straight to be able to align, but what I can see is these reflections. So you see here we've got this little lamppost thingy, I think it is, here, yeah, and the reflection here, and the reflection's leaning. And typically, reflections are, generally speaking, symmetrical to the area above, and it wouldn't lean if it was straight. So in my head, it's quite clear that we've got a little bit of perspective distortion going on, and that actually makes sense given it was shot with a 10mm lens. So we've got two things that we need to try and fix here. One is that lean. Two, I also want to try and fix this and get rid of it out of our frame. So if I just wanted to fix the lean, well, I could do that with our vertical keystone tool. So let's place our vertical line here in the middle of this tower and here. Normally, I'd tell you to use a line that's as far towards the edge as possible. We don't have one in this case, but this one's pretty good. And then I've got to imagine a virtual line over this lamppost thing. And I'm just going to line it up to probably, let's just actually use the reflection. So that reflection there through to the lamppost itself. Let's just have a little zoom in here just so we get it right. So about there, just off to the left of it. That looks pretty good. And hit apply. Okay, now we have a nice straight chimney stack or pole there. And yeah, this is better on the left-hand side. Let me just check something. Okay, in here, Keystone tool. We've talked about it before. The default, for some reason, in Capture One is 80. It does make sense sometimes, but when you're doing strict architecture stuff, make sure this is set to 100, and you'll see that it forces that line even stronger. Okay. You are always going to have in the corners of an ultra-wide lens, you're always going to have that pull. So don't get the pull confused with something that's slightly leaning. But to me then, this looks pretty good. Let's just get rid of our guides. Okay, that's a lot better. It's a lot straighter, all good. Now I want to look at this thing here. I can't rotate the image. If I were to rotate it, well, at the moment, so it's straight across that horizon. But if I rotate it to the point where we get rid of this, well, obviously that doesn't work. So let's not do that. Let's instead use keystoning again to do the same thing. So we've got our keystone vertical. We've also got keystone horizontal. But in this case, we're actually going to use keystone horizontal and vertical together as a four-way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line. And the reason I can get away with this is because there's nothing detailed here on the left. If there were more buildings on the left, and I tried to do what I'm about to do, you'd see the buildings pull and stretch in a weird way, and that's not going to be very good. But I want to get rid of this bottom bit without twisting the image. So if I use this line here and here to line up, I keep my vertical ones where they were, the lines, but I'm lining up to this line here. That's great. But you see this line up here, well, that's going to mean that the image shifts effectively. It's going to twist. So instead, I'm going to pull this left-hand side by the same amount, roughly, as the bottom. So if you think about what the image is about to do, we've got our straightness corrected because we've already put them in place. So they're correct and they're vertically straight. But now with that change, or sorry, let me mimic it, that change there, what Capture One is going to do is it's going to pull the top and the bottom of the left-hand side out towards the edge of the frame and leave the right-hand side where it is. That's going to have the effect of losing this part of the platform. It's also going to lose some of the sky up here, but I'm not too worried about that. Let's have a look at what it does first. Let's hit apply. Okay, quite a dramatic crop. So you can see what Capture One's done. It's pulled here and here. We've got a few tweaks that we need to make, but it's done what I wanted it to do. It's got rid of this bottom line here, and it's got rid of some of the sky up here, but I'm hopeful that that's going to be fine. One of the questions just come in from Andrea saying, can you help yourself with the grid lines during Keystone? Absolutely. If I turn my grid lines on, if I'm not happy with the number of grid lines, remember it's in the lens tab by default. Down here under grid, you've got the choice of how many you want on the long edge and how many you want on the short edge, and that'll help you. But the grid lines will help you to align things when you're using Keystone. But just remember, with keystoning, you're aligning the keystone pointers, the little circles, to items on the image, not the grid. If I align them to the grid, then the grid is straight to start with. It's not going to make any difference. So just be careful with the grid, that you're not using it to follow with the keystone lines. The keystone line should sit on points in the image, and then use the grid to verify that you've got it right. I've got a little bit of room here to be able to pull that down a little bit there, and that means that up a little bit. So you see I'm looking at how much of the image I'm losing here, and I want to avoid losing too much. Again, I can pull down a little bit more. Let's apply that. That's pretty good. We're looking good. We're rescuing some extra parts of the image, which is always good. Let's pull that up, and let's see how much of the sky we can get back without changing this too much. So every time it's a little bit of pull, push to get this right. Let's just move that down a tiny bit there. Oh, maybe we can get away with a bit more there. I've got a lean here on this tower. Don't particularly want that, so that's probably because we've pulled this the wrong way. Yep, and let's pull that out there to pull that tower in. So what I'm doing is each time just minor adjustments, just to pull and stretch and move things in so that they look correct to the eye. with that done, let me just press the arrow key. Okay, we've got an issue down here with our river. It's leaning towards us here. So let's pull that back to where it was there. That's looking pretty good there. But you see now how my lines are completely different to how they started. And the reason is because I'm using my eyes to guide things rather than using the grid line, for example, to do it. So I'm looking at making sure that horizon is level, making sure that our chimney stack is level. That's pretty good. This one's a little bit out. I'm going to do a little bit of work on that again. So let's just go onto our keystone tool and make sure that we're pulling that the correct way, because I don't think we were. That's looking pretty good there. Okay, that's not bad. We've got a little bit of a pull, so we'll just do that there and there. We might actually get back to almost vertical on that keystone there. That's looking pretty good. Just pull our guide across and check. Nope, slightly out. So again, minor changes each time. It's a tiny change. And what this has come from is because I pulled this differently on this side, we end up in this horrible place where we start chasing different parts of the image. That, however, is looking pretty good. Good. I'm going to turn my grid off and turn my guides off. Okay. Now I can go into my crop. So with my crop, at the moment, we're on the original crop. And that was probably a 3x2 crop with that camera, I'm going to guess. So that's as if I had original set. And if I do that, it's going to keep me to original and keep me inside of the crop. I'm going to change this to say I'm going to go for a 1x2, let's say. Is that going to be too little? Yeah, that's a bit too little. So we are going to stick with our 3x2 crop, 2x3. And we're going to stay within the image. If you wanted to spend some time doing this in Photoshop or in Affinity or whatever and having a pixel editor, then you could of course turn on the function to say crop outside the image, and that would let you crop outside of here, but you'll end up with a big blue area up here. We're actually going to give this a try today just for fun. So let's do that with our crop. And then what we'd have to do later on is fill in that gap here. So one thing that I think we covered this last time, but I just want to cover it again just so that we're all clear. I'm going to create a little clone layer at 100% opacity, nice and soft. Choose a source point, choose a paint point, and why can't I go into that triangle? Well, the reason is because remember, Capture One is a raw editor. It's not designed to fill in pixels on parts of the image that weren't there. So if you ever do crop outside the image, just remember that you've got to fill in that space with another tool, some sort of pixel-based editor, something like Photoshop, something like Affinity, that will allow you to fill in that space with what should have been there. For now, we're going to imagine that's been filled in. Got a couple of dust spots and so on up here. For this case, I'm going to use the healing tool though to do it. Because I don't have a healing tool layer already set, I've got the clone layer. Let's just create a new heal over this area here. And Capture One's going to create a new heal layer, and it's going to choose where these source points come from. This was a big change in 20.1, which allows us to have multiple healing layers or healing spots on the same layer. We've actually got a big spot there, it looks like. Let's just see if Capture One can get this right. It's not far off. I'm just going to change the source to there. Yeah, it's done a good job there. Okay, so we've effectively got rid of all of those dust spots. Now we can go back to our background layer and we can pull up some shadows a little bit, but certainly in here, and you see on this histogram on the left hand side, you've got a nice orange bar that's helpfully telling you where things sit in the picture. So up here are highlights. Let's pull down the highlights in our HDR tool to get all that color and texture back. That's pretty good. Let's pull down our whites a little bit. It's not going to have much of an effect. We knew that because as I move my mouse over here, remember whites sit in this very top part of the histogram. They don't sit in all of the highlights. Highlights affects all of this area. Whites just affects there. Same with blacks and shadows. So the blacks only affect down here. The shadows affect all of this area here. So with that done, let's put a little bit of clarity into our shot. That's going to make it pump a little bit and pull up. Now let's look at this area here. That's actually in the black section pretty much of that histogram, the lowest parts. So let's pull up that slider just to get some of that detail back. Don't overdo it. Don't end up with this horrible overdone HDR effect. This is a good way or a good compromise in terms of what's here. And to me, that's sort of it there done. I wouldn't do much more. We can do a lot more keystone correction, a lot more finer detail stuff in there in terms of getting it absolutely at 90 degrees and so on in the chimney stack, getting this horizon completely perfect. But to be honest, the horizon's not far off. If I look at this, it's difficult with a bridge because obviously a bridge starts here, and then it goes up in the middle and down. But just looking at that horizon line, we're a little bit off on the left-hand side. We could correct for that a touch by doing that. There, we've then also got a little more room on our image to pull up more of that crop. There. Now, just bear in mind and see what I've done. You've got now more information to have to fill in. So the Keystone tool is great in terms of getting your image straight and aligned and all that sort of stuff. But be really careful that if you do the crop outside of image, you know how to fill that in. It's a very simple click in one of the other editors. You can just draw a little trapezoid shape over that with a lasso and then do a content aware fill, and it will fill it in nicely. But just be careful you don't overdo it. You end up having to recreate half the image that wasn't there in the first place. Okay, so remember as well with my before and after. This is before, this is after. If I don't like how much of the shadow and everything we've pulled up, then we can just adjust that in here. If we want to create a little more drama with this, we could pull our levels in like this and this, just to make it punch a little bit more. Don't overdo clarity. You'll end up with those halos that we talk about quite often. In this case, I'd be really careful with structure. Some of this stuff is diffraction in the lens and softness. If I start pulling up structure too much, you're going to see some of these artifacts where it's done stuff over the top because it didn't have enough detail there to start with in the first place. So a little bit of structure fine, but don't overdo it in a very, very small aperture image. So before, there, through to after, up to you in terms of how it feels and so on. Remember the before and after will give you the post crop, post keystone change. If I want to see the real original, if I create a clone of that variant and reset it, so there's our original, a real original, and there's our final image. But again, it depends on what you wanted in that picture for the crop. Okay, we're going to quickly go on to a second one of Bjorn's image, or Bjorn's images. Let me just have a quick sip of drink. Okay, so Cityscape. I love Cityscapes, they're cool. But this has actually got the classic challenges that we often have in Cityscapes around the color. So first thing I'd want to do is pull up all the detail in these buildings. We've got a lovely coloured sky out here. That's wonderful. But in terms of how to correct for this, well, let's have a look at the things that are going to happen if I pull up those shadows. So first off, lens, fine. It's loaded in the right profile. We're at f13, slightly odd f number, but we might have a little bit of diffraction in that. Let's just have a look. So we're in at 200%. Let's see if diffraction correction is going to sharpen us up, which it does, so it's done a good job there. Our distortion out at 35mm is probably not that much. If I go to my crop tool, it's not lost much of the sides. If I were to pull up distortion, remember Capture One is going to do the default for what it thinks is right based on that lens. And if it says 0 distortion, you're probably in a place where that lens is good enough as it is without having to make any changes in terms of the barrel or the fisheye status of the lens. Sharpness fall off, I'm not too worried out here. Purple fringing, well, actually there's a couple of high contrast points in this image, but I didn't see any fringing earlier, so maybe a touch there. Let's pull up maybe to 50%, that's going to get rid of some of this stuff on the side. But that's it for lens corrections. So now let's pull up those wonderful shadows and the blacks in the slider. So if I switch to my little pointer tool, remember that orange line on my histogram. So as I move around here, it's telling me that all the bits that we want to pull up are, and they're certainly in the shadows, but quite a few are actually in the very, very darkest parts of the shadows, which is the blacks. So let's pull up that black slider. That's pulled up those real dark parts in the city. And then let's pull up the shadows, which most of this image is. If you look at this histogram, apart from the bits that are slightly overexposed, most of the histogram actually sits in the shadows. So if I pull up the shadows, it's pulling up pretty much all of the content and all of the detail. So let's now adjust. We don't want to pull them both up too much. If we do that, we lose contrast. So remember, if you use the HDR tool to pull up all the shadows, all the blacks, pull down all the whites, pull down all the highlights, what you end up is a histogram that's been crushed in the middle. You've effectively lost all the contrast, so you don't really want to do that if you want your image to have any punch at the end of it. With highlights and whites, well, again, let's move our mouse over these areas. They're not sat in the highlights area. In fact, if I look at this histogram, there's not much in the highlights area at all. There's a lot in the whites area. So with our whites, I'm going to pull down that slider all the way, and that's just going to get us some extra information back in these really, really bright highlights. If I turn on my exposure warning, I can see that this stuff is just overexposed. It doesn't matter. Even if I were to pull down exposure all the way down, yes, I'm darkening these sections, but I'm not getting any more detail back. So to me, especially with cities, there's nothing wrong with a bright light being bright. If there's a huge light pointing directly at your camera, and you've got these wonderful starbursts as a result, leave them as they are. That's where the energy comes from in a shot of a city. So leave them. But try and correct for stuff that if you can get some detail back, then great. So let's use an example here. Let's look at this part of the roof. If I put this white slider back to where it was, it looked pretty washed out. You'd lost a lot of detail. Pulling this back down, yep, we get these lines in the roof back. We get some of the texture back. That was worth doing. But don't try and correct for every single highlight and an overexposure in a nighttime shot of light. It doesn't make sense. Okay, so we've pulled that up. Great. Now remember what I said earlier about tint and white balance and the relationship between the two. Look at what's happened to our buildings. There is no way on earth these buildings were this green in real life. So let's try first off with the picker on our white balance tool. And here's actually a perfect example of why the picker doesn't work when it comes to artificial or sunlight. These two buildings are identical, right? So why is this one orange and red and this one bright blue, effectively? So there's no sunlight in the sky. Well, what's happening is this building is purely getting this light source hitting it, and this building is getting the shadow of that light source, and it's getting some ambient light, and it's getting the reflection of this S logo here. So you've got a warm building here and a cool building here. Both buildings are the same material. They're both gray. So if I click on this building, it's going to make our entire image more green. If I click on this building, it's going to make our entire image more warm and more red. So that's why I say be really careful with the picker tool in your white balance. Oftentimes, if it's not pretty much daylight, you're going to be better off manually adjusting those changes. So let's go back to shot. Let's think about what we want to do. Well, actually, all I want to do to start with is pull this tint away from green and being slightly more neutral, almost into the pink area. That looks a bit better. And then with our Kelvin, well, I can cool down the city too much. I can warm up the city. And actually, in this city in particular, this sort of looks quite nice. It's because it doesn't make sense that it's completely cool blue. We've still got light in the sky. It's still around sunset. So let's leave it relatively warm, maybe up to here. And with our tint, we can create a little bit of neutrality. So let's get away from these turning green and keep them relatively neutral buildings up to there. Okay, let's just, before we do anything else, let's just do a before and after. So there's our before, there's our after. Now we've done two things, just to recap. One, we've pulled up the shadows, but two, as a result of pulling up the shadows, we could see the colors that these buildings have ended up because of the white balance automation within the camera. Didn't quite get it right. So as a result, we've needed to correct for that with a manual white balance adjustment. And that's what we've done here. Okay. So with that done, we can obviously see here there's a bit of a lean on the buildings. Now, this is genuinely completely personal choice. One of the very first one of these sessions that we did, we actually covered a shot of New York looking down out of a helicopter, I think. If you're looking down over a city, then there's nothing wrong with that perspective distortion looking quite dramatic. You can get the feeling of buildings coming towards you as they get bigger. If you're looking across a city, then sometimes perspective distortion can be a bit distracting because the buildings sort of lean rather than have any drama about them. And this is one of those examples. So as we're looking across the city, this lean of these buildings feels a bit wrong. I don't need to adjust the horizon. The horizon looks pretty good. All I'm going to adjust is our vertical keystone. And for cities, typically it's vertical keystone you need to correct, not necessarily horizontal. If you want to go into this in depth, there's one of our pro tips things on YouTube specifically covers keystoning. But genuinely have a look, because we'll cover quite a lot of that, a lot of this in that session. So again, with our little dots, so by clicking on the keystone tool up here, the dots appear. Let's just have a little look into here, and I'm going to move this line across to the edge of this building. Be really careful to follow the edge of the building down. Some buildings have a little notch as they get slightly wider towards the bottom, and you can fall foul of that if you just follow the building edge blindly. So make sure the edge of the building is the edge of the building all the way down. So that's the one on the right, done correctly. And I'm going to use this one here on the left. So again, given a choice, a building that's on the very edge of the frame is going to give you a much more precise difference when it comes to the keystone correction than a building that's nearer to the center. So I'm looking at the edge here, all the way down, following it down, making sure that it's still the same edge, which it is. And then we're going to draw that into there. Good. And looking at this dotted line here, zoom out, hit apply. And now we've got our correction. Remember, go on to our keystone tool here because we're doing architecture, and change that to 100. So it's now going to match exactly what we've told it, not just 80% of it. With that done, I can go to my crop, and let's go to our crop tool, and we're going to move because I want to keep as much of the sky in as possible. And this blue bit down here, actually, I find a little bit distracting. If anything, we could even afford to come in so that this building here doesn't appear at all in the frame, so we don't have any odd things happening at the edge of the frame. Let's just pull that in there and to there. That looks good. And hit the arrow key or press enter, and you'll apply the crop. With this particular image, we might want to put a little bit of clarity in there. Leave it on natural for night stuff. That works pretty well. We might want to try a little bit of either sharpening or structure just to pull up, some of the edges here. Let's put that down to 7 or 8, not too much. If we do it too much, you're going to end up with those halos and those dark lines around a lot of the detail areas. But to me, we're pretty good there. So again, before and after. So there's our before. There's our after. To me, that's just a lot more striking as a city shot. We can, if we want to, also pull up a little bit of contrast, a little bit of brightness overall. Brightness helps us pull up the overall brightness of the image differently to exposure. If I pull up exposure, it shifts the whole histogram. Brightness squashes the histogram, so it pulls up the shadows towards the brighter area without pushing those highlights off the edge. And there you go. So from my point of view, that's probably how I'd leave it in this case. You've got all the detail of the city down below, but you haven't lost the contrast. Please, please don't overdo this. Don't do that and that with the shadows and the blacks. It became very popular on Instagram a little while ago for this sort of cartoony effect. It just doesn't make sense. The city only glows if there are shadows. Just remember that. So you need shadows as well as highlights to make a city really pop at night. Okay, let's go on to this section, or this image. This is from, I think it's Garbo, not quite sure, but one of those two probably covered it. So the question came in around how we fix the highlights in this image. Having looked at the image, it's not actually a highlight issue that we're talking about. What we're trying to get is more contrast. And actually, some of this is probably haze, looking at that horizon out of the outside, but a lot of it is just the fact that if I look at my histogram, our exposure is actually pretty spot on. We've just lumped most of the histogram smack bang in the middle of the frame, in the middle of the, most of the content of the image smack bang in the middle of the histogram. It's better. Okay, so how do we fix that? Well, we could use contrast, but contrast is going to be a problem in this case, and you can see it on the screen. Watch this histogram at the top. So let me put the contrast back to 0 and put contrast up more. Why would contrast move everything up to the highlights? Well, it's actually a really simple answer. Contrast is a really, really, really dumb tool. It does great things if you've got a histogram which is all bunched up right in the middle and you want to pull it out, so make darker bits darker and lighter bits lighter. Because what it does is it takes this midpoint, this 50% point, and it pulls anything that was brighter, and anything that was darker than 50%, darker. Well, in this case, let's look at where our data is. Most of our data is to the right of that midpoint. So all I'm doing by pulling contrast up is pushing all of the data in the image, that clump of lacking contrast, effectively, and pushed it to be brighter, but still lacking contrast. That doesn't help us at all. What does help us is something like clarity and something like levels. So first off, let's just use clarity. Well, clarity is going to introduce contrast with the histogram where it is. Like you'll hear me use the term mid-tone adjustment or micro contrast or whatever. They're all the same thing that we're talking about, which is basically looking at areas and making one, if it was slightly darker, make it darker again. If it's slightly lighter, make it lighter again, but relative to each other rather than relative to the halfway point on the histogram. So clarity is a good tool in this case, but the better tool would be levels. Because if I want to make this area here sit in the middle without making the shadows drop off the edge or the highlights drop off the edge, then I can do that with this middle point on the levels tool. So quite often in levels, we use the top pointer to bring the brighter parts brighter, and we use the bottom pointer to bring the darker parts darker. That's great, and that's introduced quite a lot of contrast already, which is good. But this midpoint allows me to choose and watch the histogram at the top. The midpoint can pull the midpoint of the image around the histogram. So if I pull this up towards where my data is, effectively I'm telling Capture One to treat this point here as my midpoint in my histogram. So treat these areas here as if they're the brightest. So if it was 242 on the scale, make it 255. These areas here as if they're the darkest. If it was 36 on the scale, make it 0, so make it darker. But more importantly, move this entire middle section to make it so that if you were here on the histogram, you're now in the middle. In other words, the middle part has been shifted to be darker. Let me just pull that back a little bit there. Okay. So in this case, with those two changes, a little bit of clarity, not a lot, and those shifts in levels, look at the change we've made to the histogram. We've pulled it, we've made it more pronounced, more high contrast. We've got the lighter parts of the image lighter, the darker parts of the image darker, and we've shifted the bulk of the histogram from being in the upper part of the image to the lower part. Funnily enough, now if I go back to my contrast tool, it would actually pull more of the darks and more of the lights apart from each other because we're starting off with more in the middle. And Eric, yeah, because contrast is a really, really dumb tool. It kind of is, but not in a bad way. It's a sledgehammer. If you want to add contrast to an image which has a pretty flat histogram, then the contrast tool will do it. It'll take everything to the right of halfway and make it brighter, everything to the left of halfway and make it darker, and there's your contrast. But if you want something a bit more intelligent, a little bit more subtle, then maybe try and use clarity and maybe use levels or even curves, which if you want to get to a slightly more advanced place, to do micro contrast adjustments based on the data in your histogram, not just the overall 255 scale. Again, let's go to before and after. So there's our before, there's our after. We haven't really rescued as such the highlights. We haven't needed to. All we've done is we've increased contrast, and then you've got this sort of clearing effect. We've got rid of the mist, the murkiness, the haze. We cover some of this stuff again. So there's another pro tips video on dehazing. So search for dehaze tool or whatever. Capture One has got a lot of tools which help do things like dehaze, but in such a granular level of detail that you've got so much more control over just one big dehaze slider that does the same thing. Okay, so let's have a little look at our next little shot. Claudio, okay, London. Let's just turn off our before and after because there's no change. So London skyline, that's the sky bar or whatever it's called there. Talkie building. First off, lens adjustment. So again, it's pulled in the right lens. If it hadn't, and I'd said this before, that I'd cover it in order of preference, the right lens. If Capture One is loaded in the right lens, then stick with that. If it hasn't, then go for manufacturer profile if your camera has embedded the lens information in the raw file. That's the next best. If you do manufacturer profile, make sure you do an analyze on the raw image. To get your chromatic aberration correct. If you don't have a manufacturer profile or the correct lens, go for generic. In generic, if I tick chromatic aberration, make sure that it's done the full analyze again for this particular image, which means Capture One's then not relying on the lens profile to check any CA issues. It's actually going to analyze the actual picture and try and correct for it there for you instead. However, if you've got the right lens, use that. I would still always do an analyze on the picture for chromatic aberration, but that profile is going to load in the correct distortion and the correct diffraction correction and everything for this particular lens on that particular image. Okay. So let's just do a little bit of pulling on this one. So I'm not sure if it's so much of a lean. The challenge you have when you're shooting a river, and I've stood at this place before, as a river goes away from you, you tend to get this sort of convergence of lines, which isn't actually a lean. If we have a look at this picture, actually we're pretty much straight. Let's pull our little guide across. So let's take this line of this building down here. It's a little bit off, not anything drastic though. Yeah, the reflections are a little bit leaning. So let's just use our straighten tool. Just pull that across what I think is the horizon. Yeah, it's done a little bit of correction, nothing major. But the river is going to effectively run away from us because it's going off into the distance. We've got two choices. We could pull it with our keystone tool. Let's give it a go. So keystone horizontal, just like before. Be careful, we don't want to change that vertical line. The vertical line's good. I'm just going to tell Capture One I want you to pull this left-hand side to be a little bit bigger to give the illusion of this being head-on. That's done a pretty good job. What I'm also going to do is change our crop to be 1:2, and then that allows me to come up to here and into here. I'm going to leave this in for a second. We're going to do that with a clone tool. I don't like this little red line or red light on the edge of the image, especially as well with this reflection. So try and make sure the edges of your image have some sort of clean end to them rather than something sort of spilling off over to the side. That's looking pretty good. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to fix this up here. Let's do a quick go to our exposure tab and do a quick clone tool. So to get to the clone tool, look on the Band-Aid logo for the healing mask. Change that to say cloning mask. Remember, healing mask is going to take the contents of something and adapt based on its surroundings. The clone mask is going to literally take whatever I choose as a source. So I hold down the Option key or the Alt key on Windows, choose a source there. That gives me an orange source point, and it creates a new clone layer because I didn't have one before. I'm now going to tell it to apply that to this area down here. Weird, we're not getting any painting. It's a bit strange, isn't it? Ah, there we are. It's just catching up. Okay, something weird going on with my system here for some reason. And I'm just going to paint in literally these pixels here, paint over to here, and that's it. We're not doing any healing. We're not asking Capture One to be clever. We're not asking it to blend. One of the problems with using a healing brush at the edge of a frame is Capture One is going to look at the information that's off the frame, in this case more of that ledge, and it's going to try and blend that with the blue water. So you're going to end up with this weird sort of move in from the edge of a bit of lightness from the ledge that's on the side that you can't see. If ever you're healing towards the edge of an image and there's more information out to the side, you might find the healing brush isn't the best bet. You might be better off sticking with clone. Okay. So with this one here, that's looking pretty nice as it is. We might want to just check in here actually and turn on our diffraction correction. Yes, when it loads up, yeah. So turn it off, a little bit soft, turn it on. It's done a pretty good job of just sharpening that up a little bit. 5-second exposure at ISO 200. At f8 you should be okay, but in this case diffraction correction has actually improved it a little bit. We're also going to do a little bit of extra sharpening. So for that I'm going to go to the detail tab, make sure I'm on my background layer. Can't do it to a clone layer, you can't sharpen a clone layer. And with our sharpening I'm just going to zoom into here. I'm going to be really unfair at 200%. What I'm going to look at is making sure that our sharpening is a little bit stronger with a little bit lower threshold, so to apply to more areas with a slightly tighter radius. Again, to go into detail and sharpening, there's a whole pro tips video. It's about 20 minutes long, and we cover clarity, structure, and sharpening and the differences between them. So have a look at that if you're wondering why I've just changed radius and threshold. But effectively, radius controls how far from an edge to look for that sharpening effect, and the threshold determines at what point in contrast Capture One will kick in and add some more sharpening, or whether it ignores it. So in this case, let's just increase our amount a little bit there as well. Don't have any halos, that's looking good. So we've now got a little bit of extra sharpening in there as well. Go back to my exposure tab and let's have a look at our clarity and just make that pop a little bit. Let's get it up to about 30, it's looking good. Now, just like before, when it comes to lights in the city, we've got these lights that are facing us directly. They are overexposed in the middle, of course they are. They're facing us directly, so that makes sense. Sorry, Patrick's just going, what's the dumbest Capture One tool? Let me come back to you on that. There's a couple that I don't quite understand why they do what they do. One of the things that's most frustrating to me at the moment, and I've found it more and more as I've been editing a lot more back at home, is the Keystone tool can be virtually invisible in certain images when you're trying to look at the little dots and the little circles. But there we go. So we'll have a little look and have a think about what's the dumbest tool. But for now, that one's annoying more than anything. I've got a weird rainbow thing or rainbow wheel going on in Capture One, which says it's having a problem for some reason. Not sure why, but anyway. Okay, so with that done, let's have a look in here at our high dynamic range and pull in our highlights and pull in the whites a little bit. Remember, we want to keep contrast. We want to keep the city popping. What I can do now is pull up shadows a touch, but actually the shadows look pretty good in this. If I look at my histogram, actually I want to darken certain parts of this and lighten them. If I pull up shadows, I'm just going to lose contrast in the rest of the shot. So we're probably going to leave the shadows pretty low recovery and then instead use our levels to pull some shadows in and to pull some highlights up. Not too much there. Actually, we'll probably leave the highlights pretty strong. That's looking pretty nice. One extra little tool, we can just add a new layer here, and I'm going to call it Sky. And with the sky, we're going to add a gradient across here. So quite a soft gradient, quite a soft fall off, just from this top right up here. And with that, so to get the mask to appear, we press M for mask to make it disappear, M for mask again. And with that, I'm just going to pull down our exposure a touch. I want the focus of this shot to be the city itself, not that sky burnout over there. Finally, let's go to our background. And with this one, I just want to, let me just experiment a second. I'm just playing a little bit. So that's too cold. This is what's in my head. That's too cold. That doesn't make sense. Leave the tint pretty much where it was while we're playing with Kelvin. That feels kind of nice there, a little bit warmer, but we've got some green tint starting to appear. I know that this navy ship itself is a little bit green, but it's just a bit too green overall as the image. So I'm just going to pull the tint up to probably about 7, something like that, 6.8, 7, around there. That looks pretty nice. Okay, and then finishing touch if we want to. Top, I'm going to call this and put a gradient across there. Again, a soft gradient to fall off to about here. This is on top of that diagonal gradient on the right. And I'm going to create another layer called bottom. And with this one, we're going to do another new gradient just up here, because I want our image to naturally fall off. I want that nice fall off on the sides. So with this, let's just then pull down our exposure just a touch. And the top, we're also going to pull down our exposure there. So we've got a nice glow over the city. And then to me, that sort of works. That's quite nice. So we go from here, nothing wrong with this shot. Again, it's a perfectly good shot. But here it just feels a bit more exciting, a bit more glowing. What we can do is possibly now introduce, oops, that's on top, make sure you're on the right layer. Back to our background layer, we could introduce a bit more contrast with our levels tool, just like we did before. And if you're feeling, we had a weird clarity thing there, reset from where I was. And if you're feeling particularly punchy, you can use the dumb contrast tool, the contrast slider up here, which will effectively make those highlights a bit brighter and the shadows a bit darker. But to me, I would stick with clarity to do that rather than anything else. And there we go. I'd sort of go from, where are we? There to there. And that'll be me done. Okay. Felix, there are a couple of questions you've got on there, two UI questions. So when copying adjustments from one image to the next, even selecting the crop tool, I cannot copy the crop ever. So on your adjustments, let me come back to you, but effectively, if we go into our adjustments keyboard or clipboard, just make sure that you have, where is crop? I may be going mad here a second, but make sure you've got the crop set to be copied across. I mean, genuinely what should happen to me, oh, composition, there we go. So make sure in your adjustments clipboard you've got this set to include, if not all of the composition, then crop and the crop outside image choice. Make sure that's set, otherwise it might not be copying that across at all. Okay, and then second, when creating a mask out of a color selection using the color editor and working on the mask layer, the color editor still affects the whole image, not just the mask layer. Let's have a look at that next time. So Felix, do me a favor, send me an image in that you want to have a look at that with, and we'll do the color editor next time in the next session. Okay. So there we are. There's our quick edits for today, with some contrast improvements and some cool city stuff. Next time we will start with this shot of a bear by Mac. So that's how we'll begin. But for the time being, just remember that we obviously have, and I'm going to say goodbye in a second, but we have that Facebook group. So if you want to discuss this session or any of the other stuff, or if you need any examples or anything like that, go to that Facebook group, join it. You can always talk to us in between these sessions that are live. On YouTube, I've mentioned a couple of these already, but make sure that you look at those pro tips things, because for things like sharpening and contrast and dehazing and clarity and so on, we go into them in quite a lot of detail, and that can really help. And then remember, send in your images using your upload tool. That upload tool will allow you to send in a raw file. Make sure it's raw, not a JPEG, and put your name and let us know what you want to have a look at. And then we'll try and get it in one of the next sessions. In the meantime, we'll catch you on next week's session. Remember, you can go to our website and it will tell you when the next session is on. But between then and now, look after yourselves, look after everyone else, and we'll catch you soon. Cheers, bye.